Hey, Pastor Kenneth here, and this is What About the Bible? In this session, we're talking about English translations of the Bible. Right now, there is over 100 English translations of the Bible. Now that may sound like an overwhelming amount of translations, and you may ask, why would we even need that many translations? Now first, let's just talk about translations in general. Even today, if you're translating from one language to another, there can be difficulties because words mean different things in different cultures, and there are different cultural contexts that we may not be aware of in the original language. Now think about this, the Bible is translated from other languages, but it's not just a language, it's from a culture 2,000 years ago. And so in translating, there are basically three schools of thought, three modern-day biblical translation techniques: formal equivalence, dynamic equivalence, and free paraphrase. Formal equivalence is a word-for-word translation. That's where they take the original words from Greek and Hebrew and translate them into English, word for word. You could consider this the most conservative method of translating. The second way to translate is through dynamic equivalence. This is not word for word, but more of a thought for thought translation. Where this type of translating is really helpful is when the original word that was used doesn't really work in English. And then finally, there's free paraphrase. Now this really isn't a translation in the sense that we normally would think of it. It's more of a idea for idea translation. So the original words used are not the biggest concern with the free paraphrase, but rather the idea that it's trying to portray. So let's give a couple examples of each. The formal equivalence, word for word, this would be like the King James Version or the New King James Version, and the New American Standard Bible. Again, these are more or less word-for-word translations from the original language. A great example of dynamic equivalence is the NIV, the New International Version. These are thought-for-thought translations. So there are some words that have been changed to make it make sense to our culture in our time. And then finally, free paraphrase. The most well-known free paraphrase is the Message Bible. And this is an idea for idea paraphrase. So you may ask yourself the question, are all translations equal? Well, the simple answer is no. If you're trying to read the Bible with the exact words and it was originally written, you are going to want a word-for-word translation, a formal equivalence translation. Sometimes those translations can be more difficult to read and require a lot more studying to really find out what's being said. That's where dynamic equivalent translations come in. These are still translations from the original language, but they take some language that doesn't really make sense in English and rephrase it in such a way that it would make sense to us. This is also why year after year there are more translations. That's because the words that we use in English change themselves. If you read a Bible translation from 400 years ago, the English words that were used back then oftentimes do not mean the same thing as what they mean today. So if you're reading a formal equivalence translation from 400 years ago, there may be a word that means something different than you think it does. Again, this is where dynamic equivalent translations shine. Free paraphrase translations are not really translated from the original. They're only portraying the idea of what's meant to be said. Now, the danger in this is the idea of the person that is translating it can come across in the paraphrase rather than the words that were actually written. So it's important that if you read a paraphrased Bible, to also mirror that with a dynamic or equal equivalent translation. So the answer is no, not all translations are created equal. For some, a word-for-word translation is the best option. For others, a thought-for-thought translation is best. For others, just getting the general idea of what the Bible's saying is the best place to start. Overall, there's no English translation that is 100% perfect. They all have certain things that translated it better than other translations. That's why it's very important that when you're doing in-depth Bible study to read multiple translations. And the great news is we have amazing resources that are free at our fingertips. Online resources where you can see literally dozens of translations right next to each other. When you read them all at the same time, it's easy to see what was trying to be conveyed in the original translation. But what do you think? What is the best translation for you right now? Do you like a paraphrase because it's easier to read? Do you like the word-for-word translations because you know that it's the exact words being translated? Or are you in the middle where you'd like a dynamic equivalence translation? I want to know, and this has been What About the Bible?